When I worked in CAMS, I worked on group programs. So CAMS doesn't have them anymore, but what they used to have was these teams of allied health staff. So I was the psychologist, we had speechies and social workers, and we had teachers. It was a partnership with the education department. And what we used to do was run programs for students who had significant mental health and behavioural issues that were in a large part impacting their engagement with school. So while it wasn't a special class, it probably had a lot of similarities. Our staffing, our structure was different, but when we're thinking about students who have different needs, whose needs are not being adequately or effectively managed or supported within a mainstream environment, we were working with a lot of these kids. So these were kids that had patterns of multiple suspensions and exclusions. They pretty much all had trauma backgrounds. While not many of them had intellectual disability, the vast majority would have been in that below average range. So that sort of range that from a funding perspective doesn't get funding but also is going to struggle to keep up. And so these kids were the ones who were just really, really struggling, and they'd been through all of the internal processes at your school and through the department, and they needed something different. So they used to come to us for anywhere from 6 to 18 months, and we had a classroom-like environment. So we had 2 teachers and an SSO and the allied health staff it was like this lens, this intensive clinical and educational lens, trying to understand where is the child at, and then how can we support them and build their skills and support the community that will be supporting them long term. Because ultimately, it didn't matter how effective kids were on our isolated little program, we were then trying to transition them back to a longer term school option. So that's a little bit about my sort of background and my experience. So when it comes to working with students with challenging behaviours, I've sort of been in the trenches with it as well. I've had like the photos we saw, I've been in the classroom that's been trashed. I've had the stuff thrown at me. I've survived it. I've lived it, and I'm grateful that I don't live it very often anymore. And that, I guess now in support services, the benefit of some of our role when you guys invite us into your placements is we have that slightly removed view. Because when you're doing something day in, day out, every day, you sometimes lose a little bit of perspective. And I don't mean that as a criticism, it just means sometimes we come in with fresh eyes, we see a bigger picture in a different way. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the process and the thinking that we use, particularly functional behavioural assessment, as a way of just sort of trying to get an understanding of challenging behaviour. And it fits really well with some of the things you've heard today. So the first couple of slides you might go, oh, that dot point's just a refresher from something we've already done. And I'm not here to teach you something new. Some of this is stuff you will have already learned explicitly. Some of this is stuff that you do but might not have had labels or names for. And there might be from this some ideas that you take away. So as we talk through it today, I encourage you to have a student in mind. There might be that student or that challenging behaviour or situation that you're stuck on at the moment. So just hold that in your head, and as we go through some of the dot points, try and apply it to that student. And if we had longer, that's what I'd be getting you to do. But we've got 30 minutes to turn all of us into behaviour experts. All right, so this probably reflects Mr. T. Can you help me, Mrs. Martin? This wasn't covered in any of the education courses. That was him as an early career teacher in a very challenging situation. And here's just another little piece of behaviour management. On the other hand, these new school uniforms certainly have kept me out of trouble this year. So those kids are really well behaved. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about challenging behaviour, and particularly functional behavioural assessment. And then we're going to talk briefly about some of the approaches that we can use to addressing challenging behaviour. So what I sort of want you to take out from today is an understanding of what are some of the key things that are behind some of the behaviours that our students engage in. And John gave us a really good presentation this morning about some of those big, broad background situations, the experience of trauma, attachment, where the child's coming from at home, and the regulation or dysregulation that they bring into your classrooms. What we're going to do that's slightly different but is related to that is we're going to focus in more on the specific behaviour. So he was talking about the setting event, all the baggage that the student brings with them, and now we're going to think just a little bit more about the specific behaviour itself. So some things to keep in mind about challenging behaviour is that all behaviour serves a specific functional purpose, no matter how maladaptive or ineffective it appears to other people. Okay, so that's a key assumption that we're making today, is that there is a purpose behind the behaviour. Secondly, it is the person's best attempt to manage the situation that they are in. Because nobody comes into our classrooms, or really any field of life, with the goal or the hope of failing. They don't want to fail, they want to be successful, they want to do well, and sometimes they fall short, but it's not usually because they don't want it, it's because they don't have the skills how. And then the third dot point, which we picked up quite clearly this morning, is what might be unacceptable behaviour in one setting may be reinforced in another. So for some of the kids at home, if they want to get noticed, if they want to get their needs met, they have to go 0 to 100. They have to hit the highest level of behaviour before anybody gives them any attention. Now for you in your class, they probably just need to put their hand up and they'll get that attention, or say excuse me. Those low-level behaviours that you would reinforce by giving them your attention and your assistance, when they do that at home, it gets missed, it gets ignored. So they've learned through repetition that the best way to get an adult's attention or support is to go for gold. But so what's adaptive at home becomes maladaptive at school. And we also have to remember, we heard about Maslow's hierarchy earlier. One of his other famous statements is, if the only tool you have is a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail. And these are our kids. They've only got 1 or 2 tools and they just use it in every situation. So these are the key functions behind challenging behaviour, and you often see this, particularly the top 4 written down. So what are the reasons behind why our students, our young people, are engaging in these behaviours? So the first one is avoidance, or to escape a non-preferred person or activity. So sort of a really classic simple one is, if you give me a maths task and I don't want to do maths, I know that if I act up, if I yell, I swear, I tip over a chair, I'll get sent out of the classroom and therefore I won't have to do the task. So that's avoidance. You might use it to get something that you want, an object. So we've all seen 2-year-olds with, they're still developing their play skills. If one 2-year-old has the truck and the other 2-year-old wants it, one of their strategies might be to go and donk them on the head so they cry and they drop the truck and you pick it up and you got what you want. Now, it's a social skill we grow out of, hopefully, but it's an example of using a behaviour to get what we want. We may also use it to initiate or maintain a social connection. So I guess that's like the example I said of the child going from 0 to 100 to get noticed because the low-level behaviour didn't get noticed. And I'm really careful with my language around this. I always call it around social connection, because the other way we hear this said a lot is the class clown or the attention seeker. We hear that language a lot, but I think that often that's actually it's got a really negative connotation, because it is quite natural and normal to want to connect socially. I mean, we are social beings. So I think just to call it attention seeking isn't actually as deep as the need is. So it is about getting that social contact and connection, but not having the skills to do it. The fourth one is to express distress, emotion, or sensory needs. So when John talked today about those dysregulated behaviours that dysregulate others, that's what he was talking about, those behaviours. That student that just needs to move, that just paces and wears holes in your carpet because they can't sit still in class. But if they're moving in class, they're still paying attention, they're regulating. Everyone else is going, slow down, like sit down, be quiet. We as adults, we manage that in different ways. Some of you will be pen clickers, some of you will do this with your feet under the desk. We all have these little quirks and needs, but our kids seem to bring it out in bigger ways. And then the fifth one, which is particularly for adolescents, you don't see it written down anywhere, but my experience working with adolescents and going through the rupture and then the repair process over and over again, and you'd be talking about what's the deal with what happened, what's going on, and they will say something along the lines of, but my mates were watching. I couldn't do what the teacher said because then I'd look like a wuss in front of my mates. And their mates are way more powerful and way more interesting than you. So they win every time when you're thinking about an adolescent. So often the time we see young people, particularly the adolescents, engage in behaviours that they know are wrong, that they don't want to do, but they don't see any alternative way of getting out of that situation and giving you what you want without looking like a wuss in front of their mates. And so that's a real sort of trap for some of them. So just hold those key functions of behaviour in mind. So what is a functional behavioural assessment? So it's a really broad term that we use that is basically got the goal of helping us to figure out what function a behaviour serves for the person. All right, so it's an attempt to understand the logic behind what that person is doing in that moment. So how do we do it? So the first thing we do is we define the behaviour. Like, what is the behaviour that we're interested in? And when we're talking about tricky, challenging students, as many of you have in your class, they don't necessarily have one behaviour or one challenging situation. They have a dozen. And so sometimes the goal is to go, well, what is the goal that we're focusing on right now? What is the behaviour that we're going to put our attention to addressing? Because we don't have the physical and cognitive and emotional resources to deal with everything. So we're going to prioritise. We're going to pick the biggest, baddest behaviour, or we're going to pick the smallest, easiest one and try and get ourselves an easy win. So our first step is to define the behaviour. Then we start our data collection and analysis. So we're asking ourselves lots of questions. And there are lots of ways you can do this. If you type Functional Behavioural Assessment into Google, you'll pull up 100 different questionnaires. It doesn't matter what you use. You might do this purely through observation. You might do this through interview and asking questions of and discussion with your team around you, with the parent. And these are the sorts of questions that you're trying to figure out. Where is the behaviour happening? Why does it happen in the yard but not in the classroom, or vice versa? So where is it not happening? How often is the behaviour occurring? Is this something that happens every day or only on Mondays? Who is around when it occurs? So does it happen in front of the whole class, or does it only happen when certain other students or certain other teachers are around? What happens right before or right after the behaviour? So the right before, the trigger, what the technical word would be the antecedent. So what are the behaviours? What's going on in the classroom around? It always happens at 5 to 11 when we're packing up for recess. What happens right after the behaviour? Well, the student gets to go out to recess, or whatever it might be. And then as we're starting to get further down and we're starting to problem solve, what might be some more acceptable behaviours that we can teach the student to use instead of the behaviour that they're currently using to meet that need? So again, like I said, lots of different ways that we can do it, and there will be patterns. So the program I used to work on, we used to discover that we were a 4-day-a-week program, Monday to Thursday. Monday, worst behaviour of the week. If we looked at all of our incident reports, Monday was the toughest day, Tuesday was a bit better, Wednesday was our good day. Wednesday was when things worked really well. Thursday, end of the week, we're all a bit tired and cranky, behaviour got worse again. Go back, have their weekend at home, come back to our program, take a day of settling in. So that pattern repeated over and over. And it happened over the course of a term too. Week 8, worst week. Always, every term. Everybody's tired, but the holidays are just not quite close enough for you to grasp onto. So there are patterns in some of these behaviours, and if we look at them, we can find some of them. So what we've done, we've got all of our data, we've had our conversation with our team. Now what we need to do is develop a hypothesis, our best guess to explain the behaviour. And while John didn't call them hypotheses, he talked a lot about them this morning. He talked about those statements you might make to the student. He said, I don't ask students questions about what's going on. He said, I make a statement. And his statements would probably start with something like, it seemed to me, or I wonder if, and then the student could respond. So that might be what you're doing with a more verbal or more skilled sort of student as part of your repair process. But as a team, you're wondering with each other, I wonder if this best explains that. And then from there, we can develop a plan. So this is a hypothesis. We put them in the format of down here. So we say when, and then we insert the trigger, what's going on. Then we describe the behaviour, and then we describe the function of the behaviour. So when given numeracy tasks, so numeracy is the trigger, Tom will yell and swear the behaviour in order to get sent out of the class and avoid the task. That is the intended outcome or consequence. So the consequence isn't, well, then he got a detention, or then he had to come back afterwards. For him, the consequence of the behaviour was getting out of the task in the short term. And then we use this hypothesis that we've developed to guide our intervention. And it might be that as you develop hypotheses, you and your team disagree. You might go, well, I think it's this, and someone else goes, well, I think it's that. So sometimes we might need to test, or we might need to gather a little bit more data to see if we can narrow it in. But it's a hypothesis. It's our best guess at what's going on, and we won't always be right. But over time we'll learn, oh, that wasn't right, maybe it's something else. So this is how our hypothesis informs our intervention. So here's an example of the beginning of a hypothesis. At the end of an iPad activity, Tim will refuse to stop in order to what? And here's a whole bunch of possible different consequences. Avoid interacting with others. So when he's on the iPad, he doesn't have to socialise, he doesn't have to deal with the social environment. Avoid the next task, which is non-preferred, which is out of his skill set or his comfort zone. Maybe it's actually not about the iPad, maybe it's just about looking strong and tough in front of his peers and just defying the teacher. Maybe it's because he believes that he will never, ever, ever, ever get to use the iPad again. So he's just got to maximise the moment while he's got the moment. And maybe it's because he's actually really good at the iPad and not really good at everything else in class. So he's got that mastery and that confidence, which is a really strong, powerful motivator. So we sit down and we analyse and we think about the behaviour and we come up with our conclusion. And then we need to start thinking about our intervention planning. And it would our intervention that we might plan will change depending on which one of these hypotheses is true. And what we might try and do will be very different. So if our hypothesis is it's because he believes he will never get another turn, maybe it'll be about at the end of the task reassuring him, well, actually, you'll get your iPad back tomorrow, or you'll get it back after the break at 3 o'clock. This is giving him really repeated assurances of when the iPad will be coming back. But if that's not the issue, those reassurances won't mean anything if his actual goal was just to avoid interacting with his peer group. So this is why our hypotheses are really important when it comes to informing our intervention. And it might be for a complex student that there are multiple hypotheses to describe a range of behaviours, or it might be that they use the same behaviour in multiple situations. So we're keeping it really simple because we've got 30 minutes and it's your students will be really complex. So just pick little bits and deal with the little bits first. So now we're sort of going to move on because we've only got a short sort of window of time. So we're going to sort of not set aside the hypothesis because the hypothesis is informing our direction. Now we're going to look at how we address challenging behaviours. We can address them proactively. So a proactive intervention is any behaviour management that you do when the behaviour is not occurring. Or you can address behaviour reactively, which is when the behaviour is occurring. So what do you do in that moment when you are confronted with the behaviour? And our goal, and this is a goal to keep in your head because it's a theoretical goal probably rather than an actual goal, is we want 90% of our behaviour management to be proactive and only 10% of it to be reactive. And my experience on the group program we used to work in, and we would sit down at the end of every day with our team and we would do a debrief of, particularly if there was a big incident, and we'd all talk it through from different perspectives and we'd look for patterns and we'd start to come up with plans. And you would notice with the really challenging students, you would get to the end of it and you'd think about the conversation and you would go, you know what? We are chasing this student. We are being 90% reactive and only 10% proactive. How can we flip that? How can we at least get back to like 50-50 or something? So our goal is always to be, how can we be more proactive in our interventions? So there are two key types of proactive interventions I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about environmental modifications and then skills development. And you guys are the pros at skills development. That's what you do, you teach. And then we'll talk very briefly about reactive interventions because we really don't have time to open that one up at all. So our proactive intervention number one are environmental modifications. The phrase I really like to describe this is changing the world to meet the unique needs of the student. All right, and this is one that you get resistance from some of your really old school, traditional, mainstream teachers. This is how I teach my class. I am not doing something different just for him. Now, we all know that that doesn't work, and if you take that approach into some of your classrooms and you're just, this is how it is, you will fit in or you will fall out, that's not going to work. So we know that there are students that we want to set them up for success. We want to create successful environments, and you guys do this very well. So we want to create an environment where challenging behaviour is less likely to occur. We want to create an environment where pro-social behaviours are more likely to occur. And the beauty of these sorts of strategies, for the most part, is that they don't require a relationship with the student. So while I am 100% for building positive relationships, and I think that that's really the starting point of your students, and we heard that in the case study we heard earlier with Mr. T. It was all about connecting and building relationship with the student. Some of these environmental strategies are fantastic because you start them before you get to know the student and before the student trusts you. So you're already making a difference before the ball is rolling. And the other good thing about these strategies is some of them are really generic and they'll probably just be good for everyone anyway. And as we go through some examples, this is already stuff that you guys are probably mostly doing most of the time. So here's some examples of how we change the world to meet the unique needs of students. We change the physical environment. So how you set your classroom up, where your seating is, where your tables are. You guys might not be able to say why things are where, but you've got a reason for how you've structured your room and where students move and who works best with each other. So you already do a lot of that. There are some other things to think about: the light, the temperature, the visual clutter. So I went into a special class in the last few weeks, and every single piece of wall and dangling from the ceilings was covered with visuals. So some of it was motivational posters and class rules, and some of it was students' work. And I have to say, as I'll call myself an average, fully functioning person, I found it overwhelming and stimulating walking into this room. So what must it have been like for those 8 or 10 often highly dysregulated kids walking into this environment that I'm finding is sensory, like too overstimulating? There was nothing wrong with any of the stuff that was there. It was just so much that you couldn't see any of it. So thinking about the visual clutter to your room, thinking about how students can move in and out of the classroom, thinking about cushions. So how do we change the physical layout? And for some of you, particularly if we're thinking like special schools, the fact that they're in a special class or a special school or a disability unit probably already is a change to the physical environment. Some of you have got fenced or gated sort of areas. So you've already got some modifications to your physical environment. If you're thinking about rooms getting trashed, what resources do they have access to and what resources are locked away? The social environment, thinking about their play, thinking about their interactions with each other, the composition of their social group. So which table group do you sit them with? When it is break time, do you just let them out into the yard, or do you as a staff member structure the game or plan with them before the game? All right, so today at recess, you want to do chasey and you want to play football, so how are we going to figure out what we do? So to what extent are you letting them have the leadership and the unstructured time versus to what extent do you need to step in and structure their play or their planning a little bit? To what extent are you engaging in collaborative or cooperative play versus competitive sort of play? So these are the sorts of things that you need to think about sometimes with your groups. Our language and our communication. Do we role model? Do we prompt? Do we break instructions down into smaller steps? So here's things that you guys are already doing. These are things that you just do naturally because you've learned them over time, but sometimes it's really nice to say actually explicitly these are good practices. So sometimes teachers aren't very good at marketing what they do. They do great things, and then we get in the bad situations, we go, the school said there was nothing they could do for my kid unless you can get them funding. We get that a lot, and we think, but when you talk to the school, you're doing all of this stuff, but you're not always good at putting words to it. So sometimes you need to market and go, actually this is an explicit change we make to give our students, or this student in particular, the best chance of succeeding. And then the bottom one, how are we structuring our timetable and our day? So thinking about the example I gave on my program, Monday morning, tricky start to the week for these kids. So we spent more time in the first hour or two on a Monday morning doing activities that would help the students to reconnect with us and each other, help the students that are the really bouncy ones get their energy out, and help the really quiet ones build their energy up. So we would go for a walk to the local playground and we'd chat with the students and they'd chat with each other, and then they'd go for a bit of a play and we'd reconnect before we sat down and tried to do the more structured literacy and numeracy sort of activities. And throughout the morning they would have their movement breaks and their fruit snacks. Again, stuff that you guys already have, but there's a reason why we would structure the timetable, how we'd structure it. We'd do more academic stuff in the morning and more social and play stuff in the afternoon when the fatigue was there. We would think about how long are our activities. So these are all ways that we set up students to be successful. And as you can see, these aren't things that you need to have a rapport or a relationship with the student to do. As you get to know a student, you will tweak and you will change these things to meet their specific needs, but generally speaking, you won't need to change a lot. The second part is the skill development, which I think is really your bread and butter. So this is equipping the students with the skills they need to succeed in the world. So the skills that we prioritise is something you probably figure out in partnership with the student, with the family, with the other staff, and any other service providers, the NDIS clinicians who might be involved. So you're equipping students with educational skills. You're doing the functional literacy and numeracy. Maybe from a well-being perspective, you're helping them to develop the regulation of self, as we discussed this morning. Develop the coping skills. You're building into them a growth mindset. For those, the special class, we're thinking a lot more about functional life skills, how to get along with others, how to live independently, how to move through a community, healthy sleep, exercise, diet habits. So you're imparting with these students the skills that they will need to be successful in life. So you're building up their skills. And if we go back to just thinking specifically about our hypotheses, you might be thinking, well, what is the specific skill I need to develop in the student so that they won't need to engage in this behaviour? So if you've got a student who's avoiding maths, as one of the earlier examples was, we'd be thinking, you know, if they're avoiding maths, what is it about the maths? Is it that the maths that's being presented is actually just above their level and they don't get it, and we need to step our skill development right back down to a really lower, more foundational level that it is? Or is it that they just haven't got the help-seeking skills to put their hand up and ask for help? So some of the skill development to address these hypotheses will be going back and going, what skill are they lacking that's getting in the way, and explicitly teaching that. And then the final part, the reactive. So all we've talked about, that's the 90% of the time you want to be proactive, but we know even when you get all that stuff perfect, there are still going to be days when it all goes pear-shaped. And this is how we want to respond. We want to remember that in the moment, in the heat of the moment, our focus is on restoring safety and well-being for everyone involved. That is the primary goal. While the student is engaged in the challenging behaviour, that's not a good time for teaching and learning. In that moment, in the highest moment, the student doesn't care what the consequence is. They're not hearing, or if they're hearing, it's not sinking in. When everyone is calm and safe, that's when learning can occur. So as John said, ruptures are okay if the repairs are really good. So we can really focus in on having that good repair after the incident. When we've restored safety, then we look at the repair. We can get a really positive outcome, a growth in the students. And for lots of the students I used to work with, they were really good at ruptures, but because of the way things had worked out for them in their schools, they hadn't had, and their homes, they hadn't had a lot of experiences of repair. And they used to say our program was really easy because we didn't challenge them in lots of ways. But then they'd have a rupture and we'd be like, no, we're going to stick with this until we've successfully completed the repair. And then life got hard for them. But repairs are really important because that's when the learning and that's when the growth occurs. So that doesn't mean there are no consequences for inappropriate behaviour. It just means at the time we focused on safety. Once we're safe, once we're calm, then we focus on consequences and hopefully natural consequences. And to get more into behaviour management, I know the department endorses MAPA training, Management of Actual and Potential Aggression, as a comprehensive evidence-based package that gives you a framework for addressing behaviour from the lowest levels right up to the sort of the peak of physical violence. And it's used across our department and DCP and SA Health, Autism SA. So that's really it in a nutshell. That's a really broad, really fast sort of tour. There's your parent-teacher night that some of you might have had in the last few weeks, having dealt with all of these behaviours. You must be Timmy's dad. I'm Timmy's teacher. And the final thought before we take time for some questions is just to remember this. The best behaviour management occurs when the challenging behaviour is not happening. The best personal support occurs when the challenging behaviour is present. That's when you show the students that you care. Thank you.